4,000 years ago, a god broke a law that could not be broken. In a room no one was supposed to enter, with a gift no one was supposed to give. There is a passage in one of the oldest written records on Earth that scholars have translated, categorized, and then largely set aside. It describes a god making a decision, not a grand, thunderous proclamation from on high, but something quieter, more deliberate, and far more disturbing. A choice made in private, a sacrifice conducted not on an altar before witnesses, but in the space between divine law and something the texts call the knowing of destinies. Mainstream scholarship filed it under mythology, under religious allegory, under the ritual literature of a Bronze Age civilization that no longer exists. But when you read the original cuneiform closely, when you sit with the word choices, the structural repetitions, the specific terms the scribes used, something else begins to emerge. Not a myth, not a parable, a record. And what it records is this: the capacity you have right now to think for yourself, to refuse, to question, may not have been an accident of evolution. According to texts carved in clay nearly 4,000 years ago, it was a gift, and it cost something. The question the tablets force you to ask is not whether you believe in Sumerian gods. The question is, why would a civilization go to such lengths to preserve the precise cost of that gift? And who was it preserved for? The texts we are working with are drawn from several interconnected ancient Mesopotamian sources. The most significant is the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest literary compositions in human history, with versions dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE, though the stories it records are believed to reflect oral traditions far older. Alongside it sits the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. And threading through both is the figure of Enki, known in Akkadian tradition as Ea, the god of wisdom, of deep waters, of craft and intelligence. In a standard academic reading, Enki is a complex divine figure, part trickster, part creator, a god who consistently bends the rules of the divine council in favor of humanity. He is the one who warns Atrahasis, the Sumerian flood hero, of the coming deluge when his fellow gods had voted for humanity's destruction. He is the one credited in multiple traditions with the fashioning of human beings from clay and blood. This characterization is not wrong, but it is, scholars increasingly argue, incomplete. Because when you read the Atrahasis closely, when you go not to the popular summaries, but to the reconstructed cuneiform tablets themselves, translated by Assyriologists like W. G. Lambert and A. R. Millard in their foundational 1969 work, and re-examined by scholars since, a very specific pattern emerges in the language surrounding Enki's role in the creation of humanity. The pattern is not about what Enki gave humans. It is about what he withheld from himself in order to give it. The surface story of human creation in the Atrahasis tradition is well known. The lesser gods, the Igigi, were laboring endlessly, digging canals, carrying the earth's burdens. They rebelled. They burned their tools. They stood outside the great god Enlil's house and refused to continue. The solution the divine council arrived at was the creation of humanity. Humans would bear the labor the gods no longer wished to perform. A being would be made, Lulu Amalu in Akkadian, the primitive worker, who would carry the yoke. Enki and the birth goddess Ninta fashioned this being from clay and from the blood of a slain god named Weila, described in the text as a god who possessed Temu, a term that Assyriologists have variously translated as reason, intelligence, personality, or spirit. The blood is poured into the clay. The being breathes. The gods celebrate. That is the standard reading. And on the surface, it appears clear. Humans were made to work. The intelligence they received was derivative, a residual trace of a divine quality mixed into mortal clay, enough to make them functional, not enough to make them truly free. But then there is the passage scholars rarely spend long on. It appears in the tablet in a moment of unusual quietness, after the creation ceremony, after the celebration. Enki withdraws. The cuneiform is partially damaged in several existing copies, which has made definitive translation difficult. But what remains across multiple tablet fragments, in the careful reconstruction of the text, is a sequence that does not fit the rest of the narrative. It is not a prayer. It is not a declaration. It describes Enki doing something to himself. The language used is reflexive. Something is being redirected inward, or held back. Several scholars working with the Akkadian terminology have noted that the verb structure in these lines resembles the language used elsewhere in Mesopotamian texts when describing the binding of divine attributes, the specific restraint or surrender of a god's power. In the Me system, the Sumerian concept of divine decrees, the fundamental tablets of civilization that encoded everything from kingship to wisdom to the descent into the underworld. Certain qualities belonged to gods and were not given to humans by default. The Me were not metaphors. They were treated in the texts as real objects, real forces, real properties that could be held, transferred, stolen, or surrendered. Among them, the ability to determine fate, the power of foresight, the prerogative of divine judgment, and one more, debated for decades among Sumerologists because the cuneiform term is unusual and does not appear frequently, something that translates, depending on the scholar, as the authority over one's own action or the power of the uncoerced decision. What the damaged passage suggests, and scholarship has been careful to call this a suggestion, not a conclusion, is that Enki did not simply mix divine blood into human clay. He added something else, something that required him to give up a portion of his own standing within the divine order. Not because the council asked him to. In fact, the implication of the surrounding text is precisely the opposite. Here is where the interpretive frameworks diverge, and where the genuine intellectual weight of the tablets becomes most apparent. The first reading, the standard academic position, is that what Enki did was fully authorized. He was the designated craftsman of the gods. His role in the creation was sanctioned. The passage describing his withdrawal is, in this view, a narrative beat about divine humility or ritual preparation, a common enough feature in Mesopotamian religious literature. The sacrifice is symbolic. The intelligence given to humans is limited, functional, and entirely intentional within the cosmological system Enlil controls. The second reading, advanced by scholars working outside the mainstream Assyriology tradition, but drawing on the same cuneiform sources, argues that the specific vocabulary used in the withdrawal passage is not consistent with ritual preparation. It is consistent with something closer to a violation of divine protocol, that what Enki gave to the humans was not supposed to be in them, that the capacity for genuine refusal, for disobedience to divine command, was not a design feature. It was an insertion. The third reading, perhaps the most careful and the most interesting, holds that both of the above may be partially correct. That Enki operated within the divine council's sanction on the surface, but that embedded within the authorized act was an unauthorized one. A hidden gift, folded into the clay alongside the blood of Wiyala, was something else, something that the text is careful not to name directly, as though the scribes themselves understood that naming it too clearly would be dangerous. This reading notes that the Atrahasis narrative does not simply describe humans being created. It describes humans who, almost immediately, begin to disturb the gods. They multiply. They grow loud. Their noise, described with the Akkadian word rigmu, which carries connotations of both physical sound and the clamor of autonomous will, keeps Enlil awake. Enlil does not send plagues and floods because humans were too weak or too stupid. He sends them because humans were, in some way he did not anticipate, too much. That is not what you would expect from a race designed purely to serve. If you want to follow these tablets deeper, the actual texts, the actual debates between Sumerologists about what these passages mean, subscribe. Because most of what the clay actually says never surfaces in mainstream coverage of ancient history. The most significant comparative evidence does not come from within Mesopotamian tradition alone. Across traditions, Akkadian, Hebrew, Vedic, and later Gnostic, there is a recurring motif that scholars of comparative religion have noted, but rarely synthesized. In each tradition, there is a moment in the creation of human beings where a divine figure acts outside the full knowledge or consent of the broader divine order. And in each case, what that figure introduces into the human form is not strength, not immortality, not physical superiority. It is specifically the capacity to know the difference between one action and another, to choose. In the Hebrew tradition, it is the serpent in the garden, a figure that some early Jewish textual scholars, working with the Agadic literature, connected explicitly to the Mesopotamian Enki through shared characteristics, the association with water, with wisdom, with a kind of dangerous cleverness that operates just beneath the law. In Gnostic texts, the Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Egypt in 1945, containing documents that predate Christian canon and draw on far older Near Eastern traditions, the figure of Sophia, the divine wisdom, introduces into the first human a spark that the ruling powers of the cosmos did not intend to be there. A passage in the Apocryphon of John describes the chief architect of creation discovering, with something the text characterizes as alarm, that the human being has been given a capacity he cannot take back. The language in that passage, written centuries after the Sumerian tablets, in a completely different language and cultural context, is structurally almost identical to the damaged Atrahasis passage about Enki's withdrawal. That could be coincidence. It could be the inheritance of a shared literary tradition across millennia. Or it could be that multiple ancient cultures, separated by geography and time, were all trying to describe the same event. And all of them understood it the same way, as something that was not supposed to happen. Pause here for a moment. Not with the texts, with the clay itself. Imagine the room where these tablets were kept. The Great Idaba, the tablet house of ancient Nippur, one of Sumer's most sacred cities, situated between the Tigris and the Euphrates in what is now southern Iraq. The tablets there numbered in the tens of thousands. They were stored on shelves of fired brick, catalogued by trained scribes who spent years mastering the 60-plus signs of cuneiform notation. The room would have smelled of dust and river clay. The light would have been oil flame, a narrow, yellow warmth that made the press signs on each tablet leap and recede as the flame moved. The scribes who copied these passages were not storytellers in the modern sense. They were preservationists. Their job was transmission, to ensure that what was written was not lost, not changed, not corrupted. They copied damaged originals with notes in the margins indicating where the text was broken. They preserved variant readings. They flagged contradictions between different versions without resolving them. They were treating these texts the way a later culture might treat a legal archive, not as mythology to be enjoyed, but as record to be kept, which means that the passage about Enki's withdrawal, the damaged lines, the unusual vocabulary, the reflexive verb form that implies something directed inward rather than outward, was considered worth preserving by people who spent their professional lives deciding what was worth preserving. They kept it, across centuries, across dynasties, across the rise and fall of empires that rewrote everything else. They kept this. Now comes the part of the tablets that most retellings choose to leave out. The creation of humanity does not resolve the tension in the Atrahasis text. It deepens it. And the reason it deepens is specific. After humans are made and set to work, a pattern emerges in the text that scholars working with the Atrahasis have described as structurally anomalous. The gods send punishment, disease, drought, flood, each time intending a final erasure. Each time, Enki intervenes. He warns the humans. He gives them a way out. In the standard reading, Enki is breaking a rule out of sympathy. He likes humans. He finds them interesting. He is, in the tradition's characterization, a soft-hearted god who cannot bring himself to follow through on Enlil's decrees. But there is another way to read it. What if Enki is not acting out of sympathy? What if he is acting out of obligation? Because if the sacrifice described in the damage passage is what the comparative textual evidence suggests, if Enki gave something of himself into the human form, surrendered something from his own divine standing to embed a capacity that was not authorized, then the humans who carry that capacity are not simply mortals who got lucky. They are, in a very specific sense, Enki's responsibility, not by divine law, by something older, by the logic of what was given. The Atrahasis does not end with resolution. This is one of the most overlooked features of the text. After the flood, after Enlil's final attempt to erase humanity is frustrated by Enki's intervention once again, after Atrahasis survives, and the gods smell the sacrifice and gather like birds. A compromise is reached. Humans will continue to exist. But conditions are set. Death will be real and permanent. Certain women will not bear children. The human lifespan will be curtailed. The divine council accepts this. Enlil does not celebrate. And Enki, in what remains of the tablet's final columns, says almost nothing. What struck at least one Assyriologist, who noted it in a footnote that never made it into the popular summaries, is the silence. In a narrative defined by Enki's cleverness, his verbal dexterity, his ability to find the loophole in every divine decree, the ending gives him almost no lines. The reading this, scholar proposed, carefully and with significant qualification, was this: that Enki's silence at the end of the Atrahasis is the silence of someone who has already done the irreversible thing, who does not need to argue any further, who knows that what was placed in the clay cannot be unplaced. The council can limit human lifespan. It can impose death. It can restrict fertility. It can flood the world. It cannot take back what was embedded in the first breath, because it never fully understood what was embedded in the first breath. The tablets do not tell us what Enki sacrificed with certainty. The damage to the relevant passages, the disputed vocabulary, the deliberately oblique scribal language, all of it ensures that no translation can be called final. But what the tablets do tell us, clearly, across multiple copies, in the careful language of a civilization that treated its written records as more valuable than gold, is that human beings were not supposed to be what they became. That someone intervened. That the intervention was specific, calculated, and hidden within an authorized act. And that the being who conducted that intervention chose, at the moment of his highest divine authority, to reduce himself, to pour something of his own standing, his own power, his own place in the cosmic order, into the hands of creatures that the rest of the council viewed as tools. Why? The tablets do not answer that question directly. Ancient texts rarely do, but they preserve it. Across 4,000 years, through floods and fire and empire after empire, through the burial of an entire civilization under desert sand, these scribes kept the question alive, not because they could answer it, because they understood that the question itself was the inheritance. You are here. You are thinking. You are choosing whether to accept or reject what you have just heard. Whatever that capacity is, wherever it came from, the oldest written records we have suggested did not arrive in you cheaply. And somewhere, in a museum storage facility, there are still tablets that have never been fully translated. Clay that has not been read in 4,000 years. Passages that scholars have photographed, cataloged, and set aside. The archive is not closed. It is waiting. If that wait stays with you, if you want to know what else the tablets say that mainstream history has quietly passed over, subscribe. This archive is deep, and we have only opened one room to this.